In March 1982, Hank Murray turned off Highway 14 and rolled his rust-bitten 1968 Chevrolet C20 into the gravel lot of Rusk Implement outside Grundy Center, Iowa. With 312,000 miles on the odometer and a driver's side door that needed a hip check to close, his overalls were patched at both knees. His cap had faded from dark blue to a tired gray. He carried a dented coffee can filled with parts receipts, sorted by year and folded twice. Across the lot sat a row of polished tractors with decals, bright enough to catch the weak spring sun, each one tagged between $72,000 and $96,000, each one paired with a financing sheet printed in clean black ink. Dale Rusk was waiting near the showroom glass in pressed khakis, logo jacket, and boots that still held showroom shine. He recognized Hank, gave him the salesman's smile, and led with urgency. The county needed capacity, he said. Everyone was scaling. Marshall, Grundy, Blackhawk, same story. Bigger iron, wider planters, faster turns. Then Hank lifted the coffee can and asked for a gasket set for a 1954 Farmall Super M, plus a water pump kit and 2 belts. Dale paused, then laughed in full view of the counter. It was not subtle. It was social sorting in real time. Around them, 2 younger operators discussed 7-year notes and spring delivery dates. One signed that afternoon at a variable rate starting near 12.5%. Another took a package with deferred principal and an annual reset he barely read. Hank stood there with his can of receipts and asked whether Dale still had the old cast-iron thermostat housing in stock. The parts total came to $428.17 with tax. Hank counted out 4 $100 bills, 120, 15, 3 ones, and change from his shirt pocket. Cash. No discussion. No performance. By planting season, 20 farmers within easy driving distance had signed machinery notes in the new cycle. Some bought because they believed expansion was survival. Some bought because lenders and dealers used the same phrase in every office and every coffee group: modernize or get past. Hank kept the Super M, ran a second used tractor for heavier pulls, and planted 640 acres, split between owned parcels and leases stitched across section lines. His book showed what nobody in that lot could see from his truck door: no machinery note, annual household living costs at $11,840, and a pattern of paying cash even when the purchase was small enough that nobody would have asked. That pattern did not begin in 1982. It had started when he was 12 and standing with his mother at a farm auction in 1949, watching a neighbor lose 80 acres over a note that had been manageable until feed prices dropped for 2 seasons in a row. Hank did not speak about that day often, yet he remembered the arithmetic with hard clarity. Principal of $18,000, rate reset to 8.75%, payment date fixed whether milk checks came in strong or thin. The family who lost that place was decent, hardworking, and well-regarded. They had not gambled. They had borrowed at the wrong moment, and then met 2 bad years back to back. Hank's father, Lowell Murray, never turned that memory into a sermon. He turned it into routine. Every Saturday night at the kitchen table, he wrote numbers in a narrow ledger: seed, feed, fuel, repairs, church giving, taxes, and one line simply labeled cushion. Lowell's rule was plain. If the cushion fell below 6 months of core expenses, no expansion, no new truck, no upgrades that did not immediately reduce risk. When Hank was 19, Lowell made him price 3 alternatives for the same tillage problem: dealer note on new equipment, used purchase with repair budget, and custom hire per acre. The result was not ideological. It was arithmetic. New financed unit, $14,600 down and $312 monthly for 5 years at 7.9%. Total cost $33,320, including interest. Used unit plus parts, $4,900 cash and $1,100 expected repair reserve. Total $6,000. Custom hire on 210 acres at $11.75 per acre. $2,467.50 annually with no asset built. Hank learned that debt was not always wrong, but fixed payments during uncertain prices were a non-trivial risk multiplier. From 1958 through 1974, while neighbors measured progress by paint year and horsepower, Hank measured it by equity and optionality. He bought his first 80 acres in 1961 for $21,600, paying $7,200 down from saved crop proceeds and finishing the remaining balance in 4 years rather than 12. He purchased the Super M in 1963 at an estate sale for $1,050, then put $380 into clutch and ignition work. In 1968, he bought the Chevrolet C20 used for $1,900 and kept it through every weather cycle that followed. In 1971, he rented an adjoining 120 acres instead of buying during a local price spike, because the listed value had run to $515 per acre, while comparable productivity justified closer to $400 to $30. He waited. In 1974, he bought 60 acres from a retiring couple for $26,400, cash at closing, because he had preserved liquidity and they wanted certainty more than top bid. The prevailing consensus in those years favored leverage for growth. Bank officers were not villains. Dealers were not villains. Most were responding to the paradigm of the day: scale up, spread fixed cost, chase efficiency gains. Hank listened, thanked them, and went home to his ledger. His annual machinery outlay from 1975 through 1981 averaged $2,893, including salvage parts, bearings, hoses, welding rod, and occasional machine shop labor. During the same window, neighbors with newer fleets often carried annual principal and interest obligations above $22,000 before fuel or fertilizer. That did not make them reckless. It made them exposed. By late summer 1981, Hank's operating method looked old-fashioned and, to many observers, fragile. He still inspected every implement pin himself before dawn work. He still bought filters by case when a distributor gave a seasonal discount. He still prepaid portions of nitrogen and diesel when suppliers offered early terms, then stored and rationed carefully. His house was paid for. His truck was old enough to qualify as a joke in town conversation. His clothing budget for the year was $420. He replaced what failed and mended what did not. His total personal spending remained lower than many single machinery payments in the county. Quietly, that restraint was accumulating power. He also kept records with documentary precision. In one notebook, blue cover, wire binding, he tracked yield and realized price by field, not by farm average, because he wanted to know where profit was actually generated. In another, he logged every repair hour on the Super M and his secondary tractor, including downtime cost estimates. In a third, he mapped lease expiration dates, escalation clauses, and drainage obligations, so he was never negotiating blind. When input reps tried to bundle products with credit terms that looked convenient up front, he separated each line item and recalculated cost per acre. If a package increased dependence while reducing flexibility, he declined. This was the early discipline that would later be mistaken for luck. At auctions, He arrived with a maximum number written on a folded card and left when bidding crossed it, even when peers nudged him to stretch. In 1979, he bought a grain drill for $340 that needed 2 evenings of work and $62 in parts. The nearest finance alternative would have required $4,800 down, plus annual payments near $3,100. In 1980, he rebuilt a planter transmission for $146.50 instead of trading into a package priced at $18,900. In 1981, he sold a small lot of stored corn when basis improved by 19 cents per bushel, adding $7,182 in revenue that would have disappeared if a lender deadline had forced immediate delivery. Small decisions, repeated, compounded. Before we go any further, if you want to know how this man in a rusted truck and patched overalls moved from defensive discipline to quiet leverage when the crisis years hit, subscribe and stay with the arithmetic, because the next turn in this story happens when interest rates reset and appearances stop matching reality. 8 months later, on a wind-cut morning in November 1982, Hank parked that same 1968 Chevrolet C20 along the fence line at the Grundy County Equipment Show, one rusted fender flaking paint onto gravel while newer pickups sat polished near the entrance. He stepped out in the same patched overalls, same faded cap, same insulated coat with a mended cuff. Men who knew him nodded politely, then drifted toward brighter machinery and brighter promises. Dale Rusk moved through the crowd in a pressed tan jacket and clean dealership cap, carrying folders printed with monthly payment grids and projected yield assumptions. The bank language had changed by then, and everyone felt it. Renewals that had floated near manageable levels were now being repriced into the high teens. Borrowers who had penciled machinery and land notes at 12.5% were hearing 16.75%, some 18.25%, with shorter review windows and tighter collateral terms. A payment schedule that once looked strict but survivable became structurally heavy. That was the crux of the whole period. It was not laziness versus discipline. It was fixed obligations versus narrowing margins. Dale caught Hank near a display planter and spoke loudly enough for 3 other operators to hear. He said Hank was one drivetrain failure from being finished, then opened a packet on a new 4440 package. $14,000 down, 84 months, $1,684 monthly. Variable reset after year 2. With insurance riders and service add-ons, annual outflow would run $22,918 before fuel, labor, or a single bag of seed. Dale pointed at horsepower, turnaround speed, and tax treatment. Hank asked one question, the same question he had asked for years. What grain price and what interest rate had those pages assumed by year 4? Dale answered with confidence. Corn recovery to $3.35 and improved money by then. Hank ran the arithmetic in silence. At 640 acres, even a reasonable yield year left thin room once inputs, cash rent, and family living were booked. If corn sat near $2.55 and rates stayed elevated, that payment line would erase flexibility he depended on. He folded the financing packet once, handed it back, and said, "I will keep fixing what I own." He bought 2 belts, a hydraulic hose, and a box of cotter pins for $63.42, cash at the parts table. The men standing nearby looked away first. By the second week of December, renewal meetings were happening in office after office across Marshall, Grundy, and Blackhawk. Hank sat at his own kitchen table under a yellow light and rebuilt his operating plan with winter numbers. Not hopeful numbers. Seed booked at $41.80 per acre. Fertilizer at $92.40 after early pay discount. Fuel budget at $27.15 per acre, with contingency added. Machinery repairs capped at $3,400 unless safety required more. Household living stayed at $11,840, exactly where it had held. He wrote 3 scenarios in his ledger: base, poor basis, and weather-stressed. In all 3, zero machinery debt kept him above the line. His discipline looked severe from the outside because he never performed it for applause. Inside the books, it was meticulous risk decomposition, learned over 3 decades. Lowell Murray had taught him to treat optimism as a variable, never as a foundation. In 1966, Hank had broken that rule once. A wet spring and a broken axle had pushed him into a short operating note of $6,000 at 6.5%, collateralized by grain still in the bin. 2 storms cut local yield, basis weakened, and he spent 11 straight months directing nearly every surplus dollar to retire that note early. He paid $6,214 total and considered the extra $214 tuition not tragedy. He never repeated the setup. He had also watched how fast respectable families could be cornered by timing. In 1978, he helped a neighbor, Carl Bender, pull wagons during harvest, while Carl carried a land contract and 2 equipment notes totaling $239,000. Carl was careful and hardworking, not reckless, and for a while the math looked passable. Then rates rose, 1 tenant failed to pay on schedule, and Carl sold machinery into a soft market to meet current obligations. He survived by taking custom work and eventually stabilized on fewer acres. But the strain marked Hank. Debt had not made Carl foolish. It had made him fragile to stacked events. That distinction mattered even more as 1983 opened cold and uncertain. Hank did not romanticize old iron. He tracked it with precision. The 1954 Farmall Super M had 9,870 documented engine hours by spring check. Compression still acceptable after headwork done in 1977. And annual parts, plus machine shop spend averaging $1,146 over the prior 5 years. His secondary tractor, bought used and maintained the same way, carried higher fuel burn but no note. Combined machinery capital cost on Hank's books remained below what many neighbors paid in 3 months of financed installments. Still running, still useful, fully paid for. When auctions began to thin out inventories in early 1983, he approached each lot with a folded card and a hard ceiling number. One March sale in Blackhawk listed a grain auger with cosmetic rust and a weak motor. Hank bid $780, won it at $760, then put $188 into bearings and wiring. Equivalent financed replacement quoted at the dealership was $6,900 with payments over 48 months. He bought a disc for $1,240 and sold an unused implement for $900, netting his effective upgrade to $340 plus transport. These are small arithmetic choices, yet repeated often enough, they become strategic insulation. 3 days after planning began, Tom Ellison came by in the evening and sat on Hank's porch steps longer than usual before speaking. Tom carried total debt near $412,000, including land and machinery, and his renewal had stepped higher again. He asked if Hank thought prices would bail everyone out by fall. Hank did not offer false certainty. He shared his own numbers and said survival depended on cash control. timing grain sales when basis improved, and reducing fixed outflow first. Tom nodded, thanked him, and drove home under field lights. He was a good operator in a bad financial squeeze. By late summer 1983, Ruth and Gary London were in a similar bind from another angle. They had built steadily for years, then locked in machinery obligations around $286,000 and land debt around $190,000 just before rates and margins turned against them. Their crops were respectable. Their books were tight. Respectable yields could not outrun debt service at those rates. Hank helped Gary repair a wagon tongue one weekend and noticed how little they were spending at home, just to keep notes current. There was no vanity there, only pressure. In October, Miguel Ortega filed Chapter 11 after borrowing $118,000 for equipment and grain bins when local projections still assumed stronger export demand. Miguel had done what advisors told him to do. The market shifted anyway. He took hourly work in Cedar Falls to steady family income, while negotiating a path to keep a smaller operation alive. Hank met him once at the co-op scale and paid for coffee without discussion, then later offered occasional use of an older implement on weekends. Small help, immediate help, no speech attached. Let me stop here and ask you something. If your own income moved with weather and commodity prices, would you choose the plan that maximized growth on paper, or the plan that kept you alive through 3 bad years in a row? That question hung over every township meeting in those seasons, and it separated outcomes more than horsepower ever did. Through 1984 and into 1985, Dale kept pressing financed upgrades, and his tone hardened each time Hank refused. At a summer field day near Conrad, Dale told a cluster of farmers that old machinery was false economy and that pride was blinding holdouts to progress. He was not fully wrong about efficiency. Newer equipment did save labor and reduce certain downtime risks. The trade-off was not trivial. The issue was financing structure during extreme rate conditions. Hank would have bought newer units gladly, at the right price and with cash flow room. What he rejected was compulsory monthly exposure when revenue was uncertain. Hank's own hardship remained real but bounded. In 1984, a dry stretch clipped yields on lighter ground and cut projected gross by roughly $48,000 from his early budget. Because he had prepaid portions of fertilizer and fuel at discount terms and carried no machinery note, he absorbed the hit with reduced discretionary spending and delayed one fence project. A neighbor with similar acreage and a larger payment stack had to liquidate grain immediately at poor basis to satisfy lender dates. Same weather. Different balance sheet resilience. By the first week of February 1986, lenders were moving from caution to action across parts of Marshall County. Foreclosure notices increased. Auction calendars thickened. Families who had sponsored school teams and church suppers now stood in courthouse hallways, trying to preserve fragments of what they had built. Hank attended several sales quietly, usually in the same coat, boots clean but old, cap faded almost white along the seams. People still mistook his presence for scavenging. At one foreclosure auction that spring, Dale saw Hank near a table of small parts and assumed he had come for bolts and bargain steel. Dale spoke with the same public certainty he had used for 4 years. Then bidding opened on 160 acres with decent drainage and long-term productivity. Hank waited, bid once, then again, and when the hammer fell, he walked to the clerk and produced a cashier's check for $186,400. No financing contingency, no pending approval. Paid in full that day. What happened next mattered more than the purchase. Within weeks, Hank drafted a lease on 120 of those acres for Tom Ellison's son at below-market rent, with a right-to-buy clause triggered by 5 consecutive on-time years and equity credits tied to soil improvements. The lease did not rescue every past loss. It created a forward path where one still existed. Hank's records by then showed land value around $310,000, 0 long-term debt, and liquid reserves above $90,000 even after the purchase. Debt freedom had shifted from defense to capacity. If you want to know how that capacity grows into a zero-interest equipment pool, and eventually into county-wide impact measured in acres, operating margins, and families restored, stay with the numbers. Because the next phase begins when public doubt collides with private liquidity and can no longer explain it away. Hank did not discuss that purchase at the co-op or after church. He drove back to his farmhouse in the same truck, set the cashier receipt beside his blue notebooks, and rebuilt his 5-year plan line by line. Land payment was done, so the new 160 acres carried only taxes, seed, inputs, and maintenance. He marked 120 acres as leased to rebuild for Daniel Ellison, Tom's son, at $82 per acre, when comparable cash rent nearby was running between $108 and $122. The discount was deliberate. The lease still penciled positive because Hank had no debt service attached to that tract, and because his cost discipline was already embedded in every category. By the 3rd week of April 1986, he had written the first full season budget after the auction purchase. Owned and controlled acres now totaled 800 when lease ground was included. Projected corn yield on stronger fields sat at 127 bushels per acre, soybeans at 37, and he used conservative pricing. Corn $2.38, beans $5.42. Gross projected revenue came to $201,184. Total operating costs, including inputs, fuel, repairs, labor, insurance, and taxes, came to $141,906. Expected operating surplus, $59,278. He then subtracted a stress reserve of $18,000 and still carried room. No machinery note, no land note, no variable rate reset waiting in the dark. He tracked progression the way some people track weather, daily and without drama. 1986 bought 160 acres for $186,400 cash, leased 120 acres at below-market terms, year-end liquid reserves $97,212. 1987 purchased a used 24-foot field cultivator at auction for $3,760, spent $614 on sweeps and bearings, sold redundant tillage tool for $1,900. Net capital outlay $2,474. Year-end reserves $146,880. 1988. No major equipment purchase, put $40,000 into short-duration municipal bonds yielding 6.1% tax-advantaged, year-end reserves plus bonds $212,407. 1989. Acquired 80 acres from an estate in Black Hawk County at $1,420 per acre, total $113,600 cash. Year-end reserves $188,335 after purchase. 1990. Grain carry and basis timing added $33,740 over harvest pricing. Municipal ladder expanded to $120,000 total. Combined liquid position, $341,902. The arithmetic behind those entries was not glamorous, but it was structurally powerful. He held household living costs nearly flat in nominal terms for years when peers were cutting from much higher baselines under pressure. In 1987, his personal spending ledger read as follows: food $4,960, utilities $1,740, clothing $390, truck fuel and upkeep $1,120, property tax on homestead $1,980, medical and insurance out of pocket $1,260, church and local giving $720. Total $12,170. In the same year, one large finance tractor payment plan in the county often exceeded $20,000 annually before insurance riders. Hank was not living severely for performance. He had built a cost structure that required very little from the market to remain stable. His machinery strategy kept compounding, too. The Farmall Super M handled auger work, lighter tillage, and utility chores where horsepower demand stayed modest. A newer used unit covered heavy pulls. He calculated total annual machinery ownership and repair cost, including depreciation allowance, at $5,440 in 1988. Comparable finance replacement fleets in his area were often carrying annual principal and interest between $28,000 and $46,000, depending on package size and trade cycle. Even if his repairs doubled in a bad year, the gap remained wide. That gap became working capital, then land equity, then optionality. The resulting tension in the local culture was obvious. Appearance signaled scarcity, yet the ledger signaled control. Dale Rusk saw that tension more clearly than anyone, because it eroded the script he had sold for a decade. By harvest 1987, he had adjusted his approach from public teasing to urgent persuasion. He told Hank that used values would collapse, that repair chains would break, that one major failure during planning would erase all his careful savings. Dale was not inventing risk. Old equipment could fail at costly moments. The underlying conflict was about which risk you chose to carry. Mechanical uncertainty you could often preempt and budget, or fixed debt obligations that arrived on schedule, whether yields and prices cooperated or not. Hank kept choosing the first risk because it was negotiable. 3 counties over, the peer group outcomes kept diverging along that same axis, and every case carried human weight. Tom Ellison refinanced twice, trying to hold 480 acres together, moving portions of operating debt into term structure at higher rates each cycle. His total obligations had already been near $412,000 in 1983. By 1987, accrued interest and restructured fees pushed effective burden above $447,000. He sold equipment first, then parcels, then lost control of most of the acreage. He did not fail from laziness. He was pinched between timing, rates, and rigid payment schedules. Ruth and Gary London faced the same mathematics with different assets. Their machinery and land stack had been $476,000 combined at the wrong point in the rate cycle. They cut household spending aggressively, took seasonal off-farm work, and negotiated extensions. 2 years of lower margins and high interest outpaced those efforts. Their auction in 1986 cleared less than note balances after fees, leaving unsecured obligations that took years to unwind. Hank later reviewed one summary sheet with Gary. Gross machinery sale proceeds $201,300 against outstanding machinery debt, still above $249,000. The shortfall alone would have strained anyone. Miguel Ortega's path was harsher in the short term, but steadier in recovery. His $118,000 equipment and bin borrowing had looked defensible under earlier price assumptions. When export demand softened and operating credit tightened, Chapter 11 bought time, but not comfort. He worked hourly shifts in Cedar Falls, farmed weekends where possible, and protected his family from a total collapse by accepting a smaller footprint. Hank's occasional equipment access mattered because it reduced Miguel's custom hire cost by thousands per season during that bridge period. By 1989, Miguel was back to 90 active acres with positive cash flow, still thin but moving forward. Two more neighbors carried similar stories. Elaine Pritchard and her brother, Wes Halverson, inherited mixed ground with promise and signed for a combined expansion package in 1984. $164,000 for equipment upgrades and $210,000 on land contract obligations, variable terms tied to prime. Their yields were respectable, yet interest expense alone crossed $51,000 in 1986. They sold cattle, then sold one-quarter section, then reorganized. By 1990, Elaine was managing books for a feed supplier in Waterloo. Wes was custom baling and renting 140 acres. They remained in agriculture, but at a scale chosen by survival rather than preference. Hank treated them with the same quiet respect he gave everyone else. 3 days after the 1988 crop tour meetings, weather maps confirmed what many already feared. Drought pockets would carve uneven damage across central Iowa, with lighter soils taking the first and deepest hit. At the same time, credit officers were tightening collateral margins again, and short-term operating rates for weaker borrowers were printing in the mid-teens. Input dealers shortened terms. Grain elevators widened basis in periods of heavy movement. For highly leveraged farms, those forces interacted in a punishing sequence. Lower yield, weaker realized price, higher carrying costs, and less lender patience at renewal. Hank could not escape weather, but he could absorb a weather year without cascading into forced decisions. His 1988 corn yield dropped below his base projection by 18 bushels per acre on stressed fields, cutting gross revenue by roughly $29,000 from spring budget. He answered with pre-planned reductions in timing, not emergency borrowing. Fence replacement moved to next year. Non-essential gravel work paused. Grain sales were staged into basis improvement windows rather than dumped at harvest lows, because no machinery lender was waiting on the first of each month. He could choose timing that recovered value. Basis improvement over the 1988 to 1990. Marketing windows alone added 14 cents per bushel on 241,000 cumulative bushels sold in tranches, roughly $33,740 in additional revenue versus immediate delivery. His financial progression through crisis years can be decomposed in simple terms. First, debt service avoided. If he had accepted the 4440 package at $1,684 monthly, 7-year outflow would have been $141,456 in payments, excluding insurance and ancillary costs, during years when many peers were defending solvency. Second, repair strategy. His combined major repairs from 1986 through 1990 totaled $18,940, far below one typical finance cycle. Third, liquidity returns. Municipal bond ladder generated $18,900 cumulative interest over that window while preserving principal access. Fourth, land appreciation on paid 4 acres increased balance sheet strength without corresponding debt stress. Defensive choices became offensive capacity. By early January 1989, that capacity began to circulate outward more formally. Hank set up 2 private, zero-interest operating notes under attorney review, each with explicit terms and no hidden fees. Daniel Ellison received a $22,000 line for seed and fertilizer tied to crop insurance discipline and quarterly bookkeeping review. Miguel Ortega received $18,500 for seasonal operating costs, plus access to an older, no-till drill from Hank's shed. Repayment clauses were practical. Interest at 0%, principal-only schedule after harvest, deferment allowed in declared drought county years, and one non-negotiable condition that each borrower had to share records with one younger operator when stable. Knowledge transfer was part of the collateral. Dale heard about those arrangements by spring and dismissed them as unsustainable charity. Then he ran into numbers that did not fit that claim. Hank's notes were being repaid because they were sized to realistic margins, not to dealer inventory targets. Equipment from the farm was being maintained, not stripped. Recipients were staying on the land with lower fixed obligations, which meant they were buying parts, fuel, and agronomy services with cash more often than before. The local economy still received spending. It was simply less mediated by interest-bearing machinery debt. In August 1990, commodity weakness returned alongside another round of lender caution, and restructuring meetings became routine at co-op offices from Grundy Center to Cedar Falls. Hank attended most of them quietly, often seated near the back in a worn coat, saying little unless asked. His books that year showed total controlled acreage at 880, long-term debt at 0, liquid reserves and certificates above $340,000, and municipal positions that could be unwound without distress. On paper, he looked less like a holdout and more like a countermodel. In person, he still looked like a man who had come to buy bolts. By the time winter schedules for 1991 were posted, the pressure across the region had not disappeared. It had consolidated. Farms with heavy fixed payments were still negotiating for room. Farms with lighter balance sheets were buying time and, in a few cases, creating it for others. Hank kept repairing what he owned, kept writing checks only when the arithmetic held, and kept expanding help where it could be repaid with dignity. The next public collision with Dale would happen in that atmosphere, in front of lenders and operators who now understood the stakes down to the dollar. The collision came 11 days later, on January 17, 1991, in the heated service bay behind Rusk Implement, where lenders, co-op board members, and 40-odd operators had gathered to talk through restructures before spring ordering closed. Folding chairs faced a parts counter. Coffee steamed in white foam cups. Outside, Hank's 1968 Chevrolet C20 sat under a crust of old salt, rust blooming along both fenders, while newer pickups idled in a neat row by the showroom glass. Dale Rusk opened with market pressure and consolidation language, then shifted to equipment turnover, arguing that reliability now required late-model machinery and managed financing. Midway through a payment slide handout, he glanced toward the back row, spotted Hank in his faded cap, and made the line everyone in that bay remembered later. He called the Super M a museum piece and said nostalgia was not a business plan. A few people smiled because that was still the social script. Hank did not respond. He looked at the inventory sheet for distressed trade-ins and bankrupt consignments clipped to the back of the handout. That sheet listed a package from 2 failed operations being liquidated together, a 1978 John Deere 4440 with high hours but documented overhaul, a 24-foot field cultivator, a 6-row planter, a 400-bushel grain cart, and a no-till drill that needed closing wheel assemblies. Reserve estimate across the lot was $71,000 to $79,000. Most attendees assumed a dealer affiliate would lift it. When the meeting broke into side discussions, Hank walked to the office window and asked for the lot total if purchased as one package, as is, same day. The clerk called the owner. Dale stepped in, expecting negotiation theater. The number came back at $74,600 plus transfer fees of $1,184. Total due, $75,784. Hank asked for wiring instructions, then changed course and wrote a check from his operating account, because the seller wanted same-day certainty. Dale looked at the check twice, then asked whether funds verification was needed for processing. Hank said, "Call and verify." Dale called First Prairie Bank from the desk phone 3 feet away, gave account credentials from the check, and asked for confirmation. The lending officer verified available liquidity, and because Dale pressed for certainty in front of witnesses, gave the figure authorized on commercial inquiry protocol. Combined balances and certificates linked to Hank Murray exceeded $1,200,000, specifically $1,247,318 as of that morning. The service bay went quiet in the way only arithmetic can silence a room. The reaction was not dramatic in a cinematic sense. It was procedural, almost stiff. The co-op treasurer lowered his pen and recalculated assumptions in real time. 2 farmers who had joked about Hank's truck stared through the office glass at the check printer. Dale, whose certainty had depended on Hank failing in public, stood still for several seconds, then told the room he had spent years pushing payment plans during years when many operators needed lower fixed obligations more than higher horsepower. He did not shout. He did not defend himself. He said it once, cleanly, in front of lenders and the board. By the first week of February, paperwork was complete, and the distressed package moved to Hank's machine shed outside Grundy Center, where he and 3 weekend helpers rebuilt it item by item. Parts and refurbishment cost another $18,942. Hydraulic lines, $2,306. Opener assemblies, $3,940. Planter meters, $1,680. Tire work, $2,750. Fluids and filters, $1,144. Welding and steel, $1,228. Electrical repairs, $944, plus miscellaneous freight and machine shop invoices. Total all-in cost became $94,726. Comparable replacement value as financed new packages in 1991 terms would have run roughly $312,000 to $348,000, depending on brand and option stack. Hank did not keep the package for his own acreage. He transferred it into a formal structure drafted by attorney Ellen Voss in Grundy County. The Tri-County Equipment Pool, governed by a 2-page covenant and annual ledger review. Use fees were set only to cover maintenance reserve, storage, and insurance. No interest, no equity extraction. Borrowers had to share books quarterly and agree to one operating rule. Fixed annual debt service, excluding land, could not exceed 15% of 3-year average gross farm revenue. If someone crossed that threshold, pool access paused until ratios normalized. Daniel Ellison became the first full participant. His original $22,000 zero-interest operating line from Hank was rolled into a 3-year principal schedule at $7,333 per year, with drought deferment preserved. In 1991, he rented 120 acres under the existing right-to-buy lease and added 40 rented acres using pool equipment, cutting custom hire costs by $9,860 compared with his 1990 schedule. His year-end net operating margin moved from negative $4,200 to positive $18,740. In 1992, he made his first on-time principal payment and seeded cover crops on 60 acres, earning a $1,200 lease credit tied to soil stewardship terms Hank had written into the contract. Miguel Ortega entered as second participant that spring. Hank reissued Miguel's $18,500 line and added a $6,800 fuel and seed advance under the same zero-interest framework. Total exposure, $25,300. Pool access gave Miguel the no-till drill and grain cart during peak windows, which reduced his per-acre fieldwork cost from $64 to $41 on 160 acres across Black Hawk County. By harvest 1992, Miguel posted positive cash flow of $21,460 after family living and repaid $8,000 principal. He kept his hourly work in Cedar Falls one more year, then returned full-time to farming in 1993 with a smaller but stable cost base. Ruth and Gary London were harder to structure because unsecured obligations from their auction years still constrained every lender conversation. Hank did not erase those balances. He designed around them. In March 1992, he issued a $14,400 operating grant, not a loan, tied to one season of leased ground near Eldora and strict enterprise accounting by field. He added $11,600 as a recoverable zero-interest line for inputs only, with invoices paid directly to suppliers. Total support, $26,000. That season, they produced enough margin to clear overdue vendor accounts and negotiate better lease terms for the next year. They remained modest operators, but they were no longer in emergency cycle every month. Elaine Pritchard and Wes Halverson entered in 1993 after 2 years of patchwork custom work. Hank extended a shared $31,200 equipment access and repair line so Wes could stop renting high-cost hay equipment, and Elaine could restart 110 acres under a lower fixed-cost plan. Repayment was simple. 12% of net operating surplus until principal cleared, capped at zero interest with full payment holiday in declared county disaster years. They repaid over 4 seasons. Elaine kept her bookkeeping job in Waterloo for stability, then returned part-time to farm management after margins improved. Tom Ellison never asked Hank for direct cash. Pride and grief were mixed in him after losing most of his acreage. Hank respected that and shifted help through structure, not charity. He reduced rent volatility for Daniel under the right-to-buy lease and covered tile repair on one low section at a cost of $9,300 that would otherwise have hit Daniel's books. Tom saw the effect without having to receive a check himself. By 1994, he was helping Daniel at planting and harvest with less strain in his voice than anyone had heard since 1982. If you are learning something from this, the trade-off is visible in plain numbers. Growth financed on fragile margins can look strong until conditions turn. Controlled costs and patient liquidity look slow until conditions turn. The difference appears when one bad year becomes 3. Hank kept documenting every movement with the same wire-bound discipline that had guided him for decades. The deeper examination is not philosophical. It is arithmetic over time. 1991. Distressed package purchased and restored for $94,726 total. Estimated financed new equivalent avoided. Midpoint $330,000. At a 9.8% blended rate over 7 years, avoided interest and fees were approximately $128,000 beyond principal. 1992. Equipment pool logged 1,146 machine hours across 5 operators. Collected maintenance fees, $19,482. Actual maintenance and insurance expense, $17,906. Surplus reserve added $1,576. 1993. Hank added a second tranche of pool assets, buying 2 used wagons and a grain dryer share for $42,300 cash. Dryer access lowered post-harvest moisture discount losses by an estimated 7 cents per bushel on 84,000 pooled bushels, preserving $5,880 for participants. 1994. Zero interest notes outstanding across participants totaled $88,740. Repayments received that year, $24,900. Defaults, 0. Deferred payments approved under weather clauses, 2. Both later cured. 1995. Hank purchased 70 acres adjoining his Blackhawk tract for $112,000 cash after probate sale. Lease revenue from that parcel, net of taxes and upkeep, funded debt literacy workshops at $6,000 annual budget without touching principal. 1996. Combined participant acreage under pool support reached 1,420 acres. Weighted average machinery debt ratio among participants, 8.7% of gross revenue, below Hank's 15% covenant threshold. 1997. Municipal bond ladder reached $410,000 face value, yielding blended 5.4% tax advantage, generating $22,140 annual interest. Hank earmarked $15,000 of that interest for emergency input grants. 1998. Total principal advance since pool launch reached $162,940. Principal repaid cumulatively $119,300. Active outstanding, $43,640. Net worth estimate on Hank's balance sheet, including land at conservative valuation, grain inventory, and liquid holdings, $2,930,000 with 0 long-term debt. Those figures also clarified Dale's revised position. In late 1993, he stopped pushing high leverage packages as default advice for thin margin operators and began presenting used equipment pathways first when cash flow coverage was weak. He still sold new machinery where books supported it. He simply stopped treating debt-heavy turnover as universal. At a winter co-op panel in 1994, he said the quiet part into a microphone. Commission structure had rewarded volume, while farm survival required fit. He credited Hank by name for forcing that correction through results rather than argument. By the end of the decade, the multiplier effect was visible across county maps, not only ledgers. Daniel controlled 260 acres with improving soil scores and had exercised the first stage of his right-to-buy clause. Miguel was back on 160 acres in Blackhawk County with positive retained earnings for 3 straight years. Ruth and Gary held stable leases and had cleared their remaining unsecured private obligations. Elaine and Wes stabilized at 210 combined acres, plus custom work, both current on all pool terms. None became flashy operators. All became durable ones. Hank remained visually unchanged through that entire stretch. Same truck, now well past 340,000 miles. Same Farmall Super M handling auger duty with fresh paint only on repaired metal, never as display. Same patched coats rotated by season. The appearance still suggested scarcity to strangers. The arithmetic kept proving control to anyone patient enough to read it. By spring 1999, Hank took the same blue notebook that had tracked repairs and basis spreads for 2 decades and opened a new section titled Outcomes, because he wanted proof that help was building independence rather than dependence. Daniel Ellison came first. Daniel had started with discounted rent and a narrow chance. In 1999, he controlled 260 acres, carried 0 machinery debt through the pool, and posted net operating income of $46,300 after paying himself a modest wage. In 2000, he exercised the second stage of his right-to-buy clause on 40 more acres at a contract price of $1,480 per acre, below open market bids that were already near $1,900, with equity credits from 5 years of soil work, reducing cash due at closing by $18,600. By 2003, Daniel and his wife, Maren, were farming 420 acres, all current, all documented, and Tom Ellison was back in the field at planning as hired help by choice rather than desperation. Miguel Ortega's trajectory was slower and just as durable. He stayed disciplined through 1999 and 2000, split his acres between owned and leased ground, and used pool equipment windows with near-military punctuality because one missed day could wreck timing for 3 other families. In 2001, he cleared the final balance on his zero-interest line. Total principal repaid $25,300. In 2002, he bought 80 acres on the edge of Blackhawk County for $128,000 with a down payment of $51,000 cash and a short fixed-rate note he paid off in 6 years, faster than required. Hank approved that debt because the coverage ratio was strong and the term was contained. By 2004, Miguel operated 320 acres, held positive retained earnings for 11 consecutive seasons, and had hired 2 local teenagers each summer for field work and bookkeeping training. Ruth and Gary London stabilized without fanfare. The 1992 grant and supplier-paid input line had bought them time, not comfort, and they used it exactly as intended. By the second week of October 2000, they had cleared the last unsecured private balance left from the auction shortfall years. They did not attempt to rebuild a large ownership footprint. They chose dependable leased ground near Eldora, 240 acres by 2001, then 300 by 2004, with machinery costs controlled through used purchases and shared access. Their annual debt service as a share of gross sat under 10% for 4 straight years, and Gary began teaching winter shop classes on equipment triage at the co-op, showing younger operators how a $600 repair can replace a $26,000 payment commitment. Elaine Pritchard and Wes Halverson took a hybrid route that matched their strengths. Elaine never abandoned bookkeeping discipline, even when the farm side improved, and that decision mattered. She built enterprise sheets by field, crop, and machine hour, then used those sheets to reject 2 expansion deals that looked attractive until interest and depreciation were modeled honestly. Wes grew custom baling routes and bought used hay tools through Hank's framework, with clear ceilings and cash-first rules. By harvest 2002, their combined operation held 210 acres, direct plus contract work across 1,100 seasonal acres, and the original $31,200 shared line had been repaid in full years earlier. In 2004, Elaine returned to farm management full-time, still handling books for 2 neighbors at night because she trusted numbers more than mood. Tom Ellison's arc was quieter than his son's and no less meaningful. He never recovered the 480 acres he once controlled, and Hank never pretended otherwise. Loss was loss. Yet by 2001, Tom had retired into a small house in Grundy Center, with his obligations current, his health steadier, and his relationship with Daniel repaired after years of strain. He spent mornings at the coffee counter and afternoons helping calibrate planters in spring. He said once to Ellen Voss in a hallway after a workshop that the hardest part of foreclosure was not financial ruin, but the feeling of becoming a warning label. Hank's structure gave him a way to become a teacher instead. The multiplier was no longer theoretical by then. 12 farmers eventually cycled through zero-interest notes or pool access between 1991 and 2004. Total principal advanced reached $620,000. Emergency operating grants during input spikes totaled $240,000, each grant documented with acreage, input invoices, and outcome review. Repayment on the note side reached 96.4% principal recovery, with weather deferments honored exactly as written. More important than repayment, those 12 operators collectively controlled 3,980 acres by 2004, and conservative land valuation at that time put the aggregate near $31 million. One household's liquidity had become regional shock absorption. 3 days after closing his year-end books in 2004, Hank met with Ellen Voss and funded the Murray Debt Literacy Endowment at $1,500,000, invested in short municipal ladders and high-grade instruments with a spending rule capped at 4% annually. That produced roughly $60,000 per year for workshops, down payment matches, and emergency technical assistance without eroding principal. Ellen insisted on audit discipline and published recipient metrics each winter. Hank insisted that classes stay practical. Cash flow stress testing, covenant reading, basis management, repair versus replace math, and one worksheet titled simply, "What must be paid if yield falls 20%. Dale Rusk attended the first workshop as a guest, sat in the back row, and did not speak until the break. His own path had bent after that 1991 Service Bay moment. Between 1994 and 2001, he shifted from high-leverage packages as default to a fit-first model that presented used equipment, repair budgets, and payment stress scenarios side by side with new inventory quotes. Commission checks were smaller in strong years, yet delinquency-related repossessions among his customers fell. In 2002, he sold his ownership stake in Rusk Implement, stayed 2 more years as transition advisor, then retired from frontline sales in 2004 and opened a used equipment consulting service in Grundy County. He charged flat planning fees, not percentage commissions, and farmers who had once avoided him began calling for second opinions. His formal reckoning came at a co-op board dinner in 2005 when he was asked what had changed his approach. Dale said he had confused motion with resilience. He said polished paint and monthly turnover had looked like progress until rate cycles and commodity stress exposed the underlying fragility. He named Hank directly and thanked him for proving an alternative without humiliating anyone who had borrowed. That distinction mattered to Dale because Tom, Ruth, Gary, Miguel, Elaine, and Wes had all been serious operators caught in a brutal sequence, not caricatures of poor judgment. By mid-2006, every major thread around Hank's original circle had settled into clear outcomes. Carl Bender, who had survived his own squeeze years earlier, retired from custom work and leased out his remaining acres with no unsecured debt. Ellen Voss continued as counsel to the endowment and trained a younger attorney to take over compliance. First Prairie Bank, which had once verified Hank's balances over the desk phone, integrated a debt service stress worksheet into annual renewals after seeing the endowment curriculum reduce defaults. Daniel expanded to 520 acres by 2008 and completed his buyback path on 200 acres tied to the Ellison family name. Miguel held at 320 acres and added a small seed cleaning side business. Ruth and Gary kept their operation stable and passed management of day-to-day field decisions to a nephew while remaining active in planning. Elaine and Wes split operations amicably in 2009, both current and solvent, with Elaine focusing on grain and Wes on forage and custom routes. Hank himself changed less than any balance sheet around him. Net worth reached $4,860,000 by late 2004 across paid-for land. Grain inventory, liquid reserves, and municipal bonds then moved with markets and land values while staying unleveraged. He still drove the 1968 Chevrolet C20, by then with mileage that had rolled once and continued climbing. He still used the Farmall Super M for auger work and light tillage on purpose, not sentimentality. He still wore patched coats until fabric failed beyond repair. When younger farmers asked for a speech, he gave them 40 seconds at most. "Debt is a tool," he said. "Use it only when bad years cannot kill you." In 2013, at age 83, Hank Murray died peacefully in his farmhouse outside Grundy Center, with his books in order and no long-term debt. His estate plan did not distribute principal immediately. It set a condition that each heir or designated operator had to run 3 consecutive, profitable years without borrowing for machinery before touching core assets. The rule was strict, measurable, and fully in character. Ellen Voss executed the plan. There were objections in private, then acceptance when the numbers showed why the condition existed. The farm did not fracture after his death. Daniel took operational lead on core tracks under the estate framework. Miguel remained a partner user in seasonal equipment scheduling, and the endowment kept funding debt literacy workshops every winter, with attendance that grew from 22 people in the first year to more than 100 by 2018. The Tri-County Equipment Pool continued under updated bylaws. Still zero interest, still maintenance funded, still requiring transparent books. Dale, retired by then, occasionally taught the session on dealership contracts and hidden fee structures, a role nobody would have predicted in 1982. If you want more stories where arithmetic overturns appearances, subscribe and keep following this series. If one number in this story changed your view, comment with that exact number. Whether it was $428.17 in parts, $186,400 in the cash land purchase, or $1,247,318 verified over desk phone. Share this with the person in your life who still believes the newest machine is always the safest plan. The final image is not a banquet hall or a headline. It is a rusted truck in a gravel drive, a Farmall idling by an auger, and a ledger on a kitchen table with clean lines and no creditors waiting at the bottom of the page. In those counties, people eventually learned to read wealth the way Hank did. Not by shine, not by noise, but by control, endurance, and what you can quietly give away when your own house is secure. That lesson became concrete again on the first Saturday of January 2014, when snow blew sideways across the co-op parking lot and 48 people filed into the debt literacy workshop funded by the Murray Endowment. Ellen Voss set 2 objects on the front table before she opened the binders: Hank's dented coffee can of parts receipts and the blue wire-bound notebook with yield columns written in his tight block print. She did not use them as relics. She used them as evidence. Daniel Ellison sat in the second row beside Maren. their gloves drying on a radiator pipe. Miguel Ortega came in 10 minutes early and checked the equipment pool scheduling board out of habit, then laughed at himself and sat down anyway. Ruth and Gary London took seats near the aisle with thermoses in hand. Elaine Pritchard arrived carrying a calculator she had owned since 1991. Wes Halverson stood at the back wall until Ellen waved him into a chair. Dale Rusk came in last. No dealership jacket now, only a plain canvas coat and a folder labeled Contract Stress Test. Ellen opened the session with one line Hank had underlined twice in the notebook margin. Fixed payments do not care about weather. Then she read the year-end 2013 numbers out loud so nobody had to rely on rumor. Endowment principal, $1,500,000. Annual distribution limit at 4%, $60,000. Equipment pool reserve, $84,216. Active zero-interest notes, $73,400. Delinquencies, 0. Deferments triggered by county weather declaration, 1, already curing. The room stayed quiet because the arithmetic carried moral weight without performance. By planting season 2014, Daniel had completed the final buyback transfer on the 200-acre Ellison ground tied to Hank's right-to-buy structure. Closing price averaged $1,480 per acre across tranches, while nearby transfers that quarter averaged $2,140. Equity credits from documented tile, organic matter improvement, and erosion control reduced his final cash, due by another $11,200. He and Marin chose not to expand immediately, even though they could have financed it. They used free cash flow to build a 12-month operating reserve of $186,000 and prepaid fertilizer at discount. Tom Ellison attended that closing in a pressed work shirt, shook Daniel's hand once, and cried in the parking lot, where nobody made him explain it. Miguel's outcome kept the same disciplined tempo that saved him. In June 2015, he bought a used seed cleaning line for $38,600 cash from a retiring operator near Waterloo, then booked custom cleaning contracts at rates that covered the purchase in 3 seasons. His 320 acres stayed stable, his machinery debt remained 0, and he hired 1 full-time employee with health coverage by 2017. He also became the strictest scheduler in the equipment pool. If someone returned a grain cart late without calling, Miguel would drive over, help unload, and remind them that shared assets only work when trust is measured in minutes. Ruth and Gary London never chased scale after they regained footing. By harvest, 2016, they were operating 300 leased acres with debt service at 7.8% of gross revenue and 2 years of cash reserves in place. Their nephew, Luke London, joined full-time that year under a written family agreement drafted with Ellen. No machinery financing above a 3-year term, no variable rate without a tested downside plan, and quarterly review by field. Gary kept teaching winter shop classes and added 1 module called $600 or $26,000, built around actual repair invoices from his own books. Ruth ran the lease calendar and never missed a renewal deadline again. Elaine and Wes proved that even after an amicable split, discipline could still compound. Elaine's grain side reached 170 acres owned and 90 leased by 2018. With no long-term machinery note and cash accounting tight enough that First Prairie Bank used her anonymized worksheets in 2 borrower seminars. Wes held 120 forage acres and expanded custom routes with paid-for equipment, then trained 2 younger operators to take over portions of his route as his knees worsened. Both stayed current, both stayed solvent. Neither had to pretend the old losses never happened. The multiplier effect that Hank had aimed for on paper became visible in annual roll calls. In the 2018 workshop, Ellen projected a single slide with no decoration. 12 recipient operations, 4,420 controlled acres, estimated land value at $36,800,000 using conservative county averages, combined machinery debt ratio at 9.1%, and emergency grant repayment by impact, tracked through mentorship hours rather than dollars. Each recipient had taught at least one newer operator. 7 had taught 3 or more. One man's refusal to sign a bad note in 1982 had become institutional memory by design. Dale Rusk's full resolution happened in public and then in routine. At the February 2019 workshop, he took the front table where he had once pitched payment grids and walked the room through 3 actual contracts with the names removed. He circled a variable rate reset clause, a mandatory bundled insurance rider, and a default trigger fee schedule that had buried thin margin borrowers in the earlier era. Then he said what he had never said in his sales years: if you cannot survive the downside case, it is not a good deal. He had retired from frontline sales long before that session, but he kept advising on used equipment fit for flat fees, and by 2020 he had helped 43 operators avoid mismatched purchases. He did not ask anyone to forget the past. He made himself useful in the present. His final business act came in August 2021, when he closed his consulting office in Grundy County and donated his entire contract archive to the endowment curriculum after Ellen's team removed client identifiers. Those binders became a permanent teaching set called the Rusk File, used to train borrowers to read before signing. Dale moved into full retirement near Conrad, restored old 2-cylinder tractors as a hobby, and still attended one workshop each winter from the back row. He and Daniel shared coffee without tension. That was not sentimental. It was earned. By the 10th anniversary of Hank's death in 2023, Ellen conducted a formal roll call at the co-op hall and resolved every name that had carried weight in the story. Daniel and Marin were still farming, still debt-disciplined, with their oldest daughter managing grain marketing after college. Miguel was still on 320 acres, still running seed cleaning, and had paid for his daughter's nursing degree in cash. Ruth and Gary had stepped back from daily field work. Luke ran operations and kept the same covenant thresholds. Elaine remained a full-time operator and part-time bookkeeper for neighbors. Wes had retired from custom routes, leased his forage ground on conservative terms, and volunteered in winter mechanics classes. Tom Ellison passed away in 2020 in Grundy Center, current on all obligations, proud of Daniel's buyback. Carl Bender passed away in 2017 after retiring debt-light. Ellen Voss trained her successor, attorney Nina Kappel, and moved to advisory status while remaining board chair. First Prairie Bank still used the stress worksheet first adopted after Hank's verified balance day. No thread remained open. In the endowment curriculum, Ellen now stated the origin outright. Hank's debt discipline came from the 1949 foreclosure he witnessed as a boy, and from Lowell Murray's Saturday ledger rule requiring a 6-month expense cushion, and both foundations were codified as required first module doctrine. The physical evidence stayed accounted for, too. The coffee can of receipts was cataloged, digitized, and stored in a locked archive cabinet at the endowment office, with scanned copies used in workshops. The blue notebooks were indexed by year and entered into a searchable database so participants could study actual repair versus replace decisions across decades. Hank's folded auction ceiling cards found in the truck glove box after his death were framed on a hallway wall beside one line from his ledger: "Cash buys time. Time buys choices." Even the old desk phone call that had stunned the service bay became documented history through First Prairie's inquiry log, cited in Ellen's legal file when skeptics asked whether the story had been exaggerated. The 1968 Chevrolet C20 still sat in the Murray machine shed, driver's side door still needing a firm hip check, mileage frozen only because Daniel retired it from road use and kept it for workshop demonstrations. The 1954 Farmall Super M still ran, now used for auger duty each fall and maintenance drills with younger operators who learned how to listen to an engine before it failed. It was never polished into a museum piece. It remained what Hank wanted: working equipment paid for. The thesis did not need a speech at the end. It had counties of proof. People who looked prosperous on borrowed timing had been exposed by rate cycles, and good people paid dearly for one wrong structure. A man in patched overalls, mocked for buying gaskets with cash, built resilience one-line item at a time, then converted private safety into public capacity, with terms that preserved dignity. Appearance had signaled one story. Arithmetic told the true one. On winter evenings, after classes ended and chairs were stacked, Ellen would sometimes turn off the hall lights last and pause by the display case. In it sat the coffee can, one faded cap, and a copy of Hank's simplest annual budget: living costs, machinery repairs, taxes, giving, cushion, no grand language, no heroic framing. Just numbers that left room for weather, for bad years, and for helping somebody else stand back up. Outside, wind moved across the same fields, and in a nearby shed, an old Farmall cooled after another ordinary day of work.